We've been talking a bit about chapter approved on the channel this week, but today I'm just going to talk about whether or not it's worth picking up for the average hobbyist. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where today we're focusing on chapter approved and the fairly rocky reception that the 2021 edition seems to have got. In the video we'll talk about what's actually changed and what you get for the money with buying these books, why it does seem like it's a bit of a poor deal compared with some of the other Games Workshop releases, and a little from the other side of the perspective, a few positives for picking up the book, even though I do admit it does have its faults. So chapter approved 2021 contains the Munitorum Field Manual and the Grand Tournament Mission Pack. It costs £25 or $40, so it's really not all that much off the cost of a full-blown codex. For that you get two small paperback books, the Munitorum Field Manual with the updated points for Warhammer 40k, and the Grand Tournament Mission Pack, which is the rules for competitive games in 9th. This is basically the 2021 version of the previous book. The 2020 version dropped shortly after 9th came out, and it had the same books, though quite a lot of developments have happened since then in terms of points, new codex dropping, and a fair few FAQs to the new rules. I think perhaps the main reason that people aren't so super keen on these is that the updates contained within the books do appear to be fairly small. The points changes are kind of a mixed bag depending on which faction you play. No army has had their points costs fully rewritten all over the place. In general the changes tend to be at least fairly light touch, even in the factions that do have the most changes. At least a fair few units have been altered for Space Marines, Necrons and Craft Worlds, and there's also the new codex points there for Sisters, Thousand Sons and Grey Knights. However, it's not really a selling point for those codexes. The Sisters one will have their codex released very shortly, so you're just going to get a duplicate of the same points there, and the Thousand Sons and Grey Knights won't have their codex for a little while, and in the meantime those points costs don't actually count for anything, and you have to use the ones that are downloaded from Warhammer Community. So really it's not particularly specially interesting for Sisters, Thousand Sons or Grey Knights players either. On top of that, a lot of factions got almost no changes or literally none at all. Both the Chaos and Imperial Knights remained untouched, the Harlequins only got one tiny points change, and the Genestealer Cults and Tau literally only got a couple of changes each, despite being some of the weakest codexes in 9th edition at the moment. As for the changes in the mission pack, probably the biggest headline news is a rewritten list of secondary objectives. To be fair, these have seen a fairly extensive rewrite. Out of the 17 or so available, almost all of them have seen some minor tweaks in one way or another, and I think that they are generally improved for the better. The ones that you'd never take have got slight buffs, and the ones that were auto-picks have maybe been nerfed a bit. I think that they will genuinely make missions in 9th edition that little bit more interesting, and might be a little bit less punitive to armies such as Titanic models like Knights, or armies with a ton of Psychers such as Grey Knights or Thousand Sons. They've reprinted and added in a fair few rare rules as well, and there was one minor change to army construction where they changed the super heavy auxiliary detachment to refund 2 command points if your warlord is also from the same faction. Essentially that means that if you're a guard player, you run an Imperial Guard warlord and then you run a Baneblade in an auxiliary support detachment, it would cost you 1 command point rather than 3. Apologies for my error in the previous video, I did previously say that they would cost 2 CP, I just read the rules wrong. Other than that, there aren't really any changes to the Grand Tournament Mission Pack. All the missions and maps remain the same, so the majority of the book is arguably just a reprint. Overall, the chapter approved release amounts to a scattering of points changes, some of which might or might not be applicable to your army, small but meaningful adjustments to a bunch of secondaries, and that super heavy change. Now I think it's not too hard to see why people might be feeling a little bit shortchanged for those changes when you're paying out almost as much as you would for a codex. Perhaps the single most annoying thing is that chapter approved is kind of mandatory if you want to either play in match play or competitive missions. The few points changes that have happened do override the old ones, and it's likely that any competitive tournaments will be using those new secondaries, and unless you have the list in front of you to remind you exactly what they do, they can be a bit confusing, and they're unlikely to be something that you remember just from memory. It means that technically if you want to play the current version of 40k, then Games Workshop does expect you to buy this book. It does feel pretty galling for the lack of content in there. It might not be too hard to be a bit more enthusiastic about it if you're playing an army like Space Marines and you've got a fair few points changes, including plenty of buffs to units that didn't really see all that much play. But say if you're playing an army like Genestealer Cult, where literally only 2 units went down by 2 points, it's hard to really see how that's going to change how you play the army all that much. I'm personally a bit more forgiving of this, but some people really don't like the fact that it can be already outdated already. For example, they issued the FAQ that put the Drukhari Raiders up to 95 points and Drazar up to 145, meaning that technically for Drukhari players, Chapter Approved 2021 is already out of date. I did mention it before, but the Grand Tournament missions are all the same, so you are paying a lot of money for some reprinted paper there. Personally, at least for the game point of view, I don't really think it's a bad thing that they haven't chosen to change them arbitrarily. The ones that we have work kind of fine at the moment, to be honest, so I'm fine with them not being updated, but having to pay for the same paper again does feel like a bit of a waste of time. On top of that, we have already seen Games Workshop implement these similar changes just via a simple PDF download in January. They did really quite a nice points cost and update to the secondaries then, basically putting it on the Warhammer community site, basically making it a big errata for the field manual, and people seem to have managed just fine implementing the new points when you got them digitally from downloading a PDF as opposed to in print. They also changed several secondaries that way as well, via FAQs, and it's not really too hard of a stretch of the imagination to imagine them issuing a new PDF of the improved secondaries. I think it's quite frustrating just after having been given a free update like this, and one that's arguably more useful in a digital form, to then basically be given a very similar update except have to pay £25 for it as opposed to it being free. Finally, although I'm sure Games Workshop would very much like to be in complete control of their own rules, there are free sites such as Battlescribe and Warhapedia. Between them, they keep tabs on all of the points changes and mission rules, and despite them having existed literally for years, Games Workshop seems to have been powerless to do anything to shut them down. When someone's posting these minimal updates on the internet for free, a lot of people aren't going to be quite as bothered about actually picking up the book that they have to pay for in print. To be honest, I do think that there are a lot of reasons not to want to buy Chapter Approved 2021. In general, if people want to pay money for a publication, then they generally expect there to be some meaningful changes within it. For example, people don't tend to feel quite as bad about the 9th edition codexes, because there tends to be quite a lot of meaningful changes to the army, datasheet improvements, and a whole load of added stuff like crusade rules or new mechanics. It really is hard to argue that Chapter Approved really has that. I will say though that in its defence, I do think that Games Workshop continuing to do balance passes is a good thing. Even though I think that they didn't really go far enough with Chapter Approved, I think that on the whole the changes that they did make tended to be good ones, maybe give some slight boost to units that weren't really seeing play, and reined in a couple of the options that were perhaps seeing excessive play within certain armies. Maybe Games Workshop's business model for this is that they're going to try and charge for this once per year, and then in the meantime deliver those FAQs and points updates for free. So maybe if we were being generous, we could perhaps see Chapter Approved as maybe subsidising those updates that they had in January. Maybe Games Workshop is trying to negotiate that people are expected to pay for balance updates around once a year, and then they'll continue to provide support and interim changes in the meantime. Despite not being really the biggest fan of the book, I think I will be picking up a copy myself, though obviously I'm not exactly a normal player of 40k. I'm very highly invested in the hobby, and it takes up a lot of my time. I think it just might be a bit more of a tough decision for those who are less invested in 40k. Maybe they haven't got in all that many games since the last Chapter Approved. It certainly hasn't been all that easy for some who've had to suffer through multiple lockdowns. If you started 40k in 9th edition, never really got to play it up to now, and are now expected to pay for an update before you've even had to play very much, it might just be another barrier to keeping people out of jumping into the game. Now they might be making people make a choice as to whether or not they want to buy an update that doesn't have much content, but then kind of be less invested in the current hobby as they're not really playing with the official current rules. I can just see that being a turn-off to some people. I'm sure people will be voting with their money. I'll be interested to know whether or not you're going to be picking up a copy or whether you'll be skipping out on the release. Please let me know down in the comments below. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly be keeping up coverage of Games Workshop's news and releases as they come out. Finally, if you have been enjoying regularly, I would just like to mention one way that you can help support the channel, which is buying through my Element Games affiliate link down in the video description. Element Games is a discount retailer based in the UK. They have 10 to 20% off Games Workshop's miniatures and books, and if you buy something after clicking through the link, a small amount of money goes to help support the channel without costing you any more whatsoever. If you were thinking about buying the new Chapter Approved, or indeed any other miniatures, it can just be a way to help out Auspex Tactics if you'd like to. For people over in the USA and Canada, I do have a very similar Amazon affiliate link as well. That one works in basically the exact same way. Click through the link, buy literally anything off Amazon, and a small amount goes to help support Auspex Tactics. Again, it can just be a way to help keep the channel going on things that you might have bought anyway. In any case, an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.